the Baha'i community of West Vancouver. It's my pleasure to welcome you here all this evening. We are fortunate tonight to have with us a remarkable speaker, as evidenced by the size of the room, Mr. Harold Rosen. Mr. Harold Rosen is an interfaith educator with a deep and lifelong commitment to building bridges across religions and cultural divides. Over the past several decades, he has led countless dialogues, workshops, and community initiatives, bringing together people of diverse backgrounds and exploring common values shared by our visions for humanity. Harold holds master's degrees in religion, philosophy, and education, and he brings academic depth and, as you'll hear tonight, heartfelt wisdom and warmth to his work. His teachings are rooted in respect for all faith traditions, and he challenges us to think not just about what divides us, but about what connects us, ethically, spiritually, and globally. Before Harold begins his talk, I'd like to briefly thank those who made this evening possible. First, to the United Church for hosting us in this comfortable space, to the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of West Vancouver for sponsoring the event, to Mrs. Nagar Majzu, who is the event coordinator for the series of lectures and worked diligently behind the scenes to make it happen, to the wonder women who assisted her, Ms. Raquel Alandra and Ms. Rama Ibrahim, who's assisting with the recording of this event and its online posting so that others can benefit from Harold's words tonight. Just a reminder, if you could turn your phones to silent. And if you don't have a handout, please share it with someone near you. We've run out, but there's a couple still around. And with that then, Harold's talk tonight, as you saw from the promotions, is what's needed for justice and peace. It's a topic that feels especially timely these days. And I know we're all in for a very thought-provoking and enriching experience. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Harold Rosen.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Nikki and everyone else. I'm surprised this many came. Oh my goodness. And Tinika reminded me, I met her 25 years ago, in the year 2000, I think, in this room. There was things happened in 2001. There was the trade towers came down, and in this room, we taught a course on Islam, 6 sessions. And then the minister of the church said, that was well attended. Will you do another one? And so there was another course on Islam. You know, I have a confession. Over the last, say, 15 years, I've been working in circles. That is, I'm not used to speaking in front of the multitudes like this. This is unusual. I'm in the Elder College program on the island, and those are like 12 to 15 people always sitting in a circle. So that's what I'm used to. I hope this can generate a discussion, even though it's like I'm making you passive and just listening to me. Let me introduce this topic of justice and peace, what's needed for them. Like you, I've been noticing that in many ways, the world seems to be falling apart. We have India and Pakistan on the verge of violence, and we already had Ukraine and Gaza and, a trade war. And some research says trade wars lead to other kinds of wars. So it's easy to be kind of depressed about humanity right now. I want to share with you something that I consider it offers realistic hope. If you turn your paper over, at the back it says questions for discussion. Questions for discussion. I want to just ask these questions and let them hover. The questions will just hover above us. And then in the discussion, I'm hoping we can either point out that we've responded to those questions or there's a new idea that someone wants to share. So the question is, how might we characterize today's world? If someone, interviewed you, are there similarities with the world of 40 years ago when the Universal House of Justice, the highest authority of the Baha'i Faith, wrote the promise of world peace to the peoples of the world? Are our circles of concern becoming smaller or larger? Are people hunkering down and avoiding the world, or are they trying to step into the world in a more direct way, in a more helpful way? How can we move beyond the paralyzing contradiction of longing for peace, yet viewing human nature as intrinsically aggressive? This book, this pamphlet called The Promise of World Peace, I want to tell you a story about that. 40 years ago, when it first came out, I'm old if I can talk about something 40 years ago. Idaho then, Moscow, Idaho. I was a Unitarian minister. A pamphlet comes in the mail, and it says, it says, "To the peoples of the world," from the Universal House of Justice, the promise of world peace. And I was living very close to the University of Idaho, not far from Washington State University. And I'd heard about Baha'is twice before. I heard two women talk about the equality of women when in my 20s, and I thought, what a spectacular talk they gave. That was one experience. And then I bumped into, while working on a kibbutz in Israel and touring Israel, I bumped into the Shrine of the Bab. I went off by myself to Mount Carmel because I knew about the Baha'i faith through those two women who gave a talk on equality. The third contact, you might say, with the Baha'i faith for me was in 1985 when this thing came in the mail. And I remember I read it and I was entranced by it. And I want to tell you my reaction. Because I was a very academically oriented person then, I was a grad student in philosophy and teaching courses. I was amazed how the pamphlet seemed to talk about all the problems of the world in many different fields, and it was integrating them. So I think I had this idea, well, either you talk about politics or economics or spirituality or morality, you have to separate these things. I don't know why I thought that way. I think it's because the university can make you think that way, breaking things up into fields. And I thought, they're integrating the wisdom of the world. That really impressed me. And then I started to meet Baha'is in the early 90s when I moved to this part of the world. Okay, so that's my story with this particular meeting. And over the years, I've gone back to this because I remember it as hopeful and realistic. So what I've done is, well, let me tell you about that later. I want to look at the questions. Look at these questions and let them hover above us. And then I'm hoping it'll open up into a full-ranging discussion. What is needed for justice? And here are some possible responses. You know, over the years, I don't like the word answer, like an answer to a question, because in big questions like what is peace, what is justice, what is religion, it seems like the answer sounds too final. I think the word response is broader and more engaging. So what is needed for justice? Maturing, wisdom, truth-seeking, all of that could be called education. Here are some other things Baha'is are involved in: community building, social action, public discourse. Those three things together are sometimes called the framework for action. Constructive resilience in places of severe persecution, like Baha'is are persecuted in Iran, and there's a method called constructive resilience. We might touch on it later. Then what is needed for peace? A Baha'i response is often consciousness of humanity's oneness. I often like to do the thought experiment of if you had 200 virtue pills, and you could give them to heads of state, and they would swallow a virtue pill at night and wake up the next morning and they would have virtues. They would be compassionate and just and fair and responsible and care about their subjects. So consciousness of humanity's oneness, that's a major spiritual principle of the Baha'i faith. Justice building, unity building, racial justice, reducing disparity between rich and poor, women's equality, universal education. All of these things are touched on a little bit in this letter from the Universal House of Justice 40 years ago. I'm so amazed how it seems like it's relevant to today. I was comparing how in the 1985 there was a superpower standoff between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the U.S. And everyone was imagining the unimaginable. There was a book at that time called The Fate of the Earth, and people were reading it, and it was describing how all of life on Earth would be destroyed by a nuclear confrontation. It went over and over the different ways that would be the end of the human experiment. So people were thinking the unthinkable back in those days. I think that's starting to happen now again with all these wars, and a trade war which is sort of all around the world and could lead to other kinds of hostilities, as well as environmental problems, racial problems, lots of problems. What's needed for peace? A single code of international law that abolishes war. That's a kind of a response that you get in Baha'i literature. and a universal framework founded on spiritual principles. These are phrases that are in this sheet we're going to go over. And then at the end, a practical question: how can we foster unity in our communities and beyond? Okay, now what I've given you, I hope this is okay. I actually, there's 60 paragraphs in the Promise of World Peace. It's about 25 pages long. Every paragraph is very thoughtful and very integrated. And it's both realistic, I think, and hopeful at the same time. It's trying to elevate humanity's perspective on where we are and what our potential is, as well as clarify the dangers and the choices we have. Okay, so Mafar, where did you end up? Right there. So if you go back to the first page, something else I have to tell you before that, sorry. There was a sequel letter to this letter of 40 years ago. The House of Justice in 2019 was writing about world peace again. And it was saying things like, there were three very hopeful moments in the 20th century. Humanity felt good. After World War I, it started this thing called the League of Nations. And then after World War II, it started this thing called the United Nations. These were moments of hope, and accelerating hope, you might say. And then in 1990, the superpower standoff broke down. Berlin Wall came down, and the UN immediately started having these big conferences. One was on the environment. One was on women in Beijing. One was on development. I think there were 7 of them. And they were called Town Meetings of the World. So in the early 1990s, that was sort of a hopeful moment for humanity. There were some developments happening. So they're reminding us of this. And then in this letter it says, but there's been retreat from these promising steps from 1990 to 2019 when they wrote this. They said, so we've some of these same problems have emerged again. Racism, nationalism, factionalism, things like identity crises, competing ideologies, rival conceptions, even doubts about the credibility of knowledge. Maybe that has a lot to do. My theory is that people get their information in certain silos, and maybe that is separating us. We also had this thing called COVID, which maybe made us turn inward a lot. Although some people, because they got on Zoom meetings, were in a way expanding their world during that time. So there's different reactions to all these things that have happened. Okay, now I'm ready to try to introduce what I wrote. If you go back to the first page, and it says at the top, introduction. So there's like 5 sections to this letter from the House of Justice. And the first is an introduction, and it introduces this theme of world peace, and it says that's challenging but inevitable. I tell you, I almost fainted when I read that. Back in 1985, all those things that were happening, it said, how are they going to defend that idea? Okay, Mafar, can you do 2? And I'll go back and forth, and we'll read one section at a time, one line at a time. This is my attempt to summarize the essence of those paragraphs. I'm not saying that is what they said, it's what I think they said. Best I can do. Okay.
2. Our choice is between unimaginable horrors or a global consultation.
3. Favorable signs include the League, the UN, national independence of many countries in Africa, for example, cooperation in science, education, law, the economy, cultural and humanitarian organizations.
4. Humanity has a scientific, technological, and administrative means, yet barriers of prejudice persist.
Baha'u'llah, founder of the Baha'i faith, offered penetrating insights with moral spiritual authority.
Flaws in the prevailing order prevent the removal of war, and many view human nature as inherently aggressive.
Human nature as inherently aggressive. My favorite part of philosophy was something called philosophical anthropology. In other words, what is human nature? Will the real human nature please stand up? When I studied psychology and sociology, I was asking the same question. I would like to know what kind of being are human beings. So this is saying that there are people long for peace, but view human nature as corrupt and incapable of paralyzing contradiction. Did you read that or did I? Oh, it's your turn. Reassessing.
I read flaws.
Oh.
And then
then
you commented on it.
Oh, that's what I did. Okay. Flaws in the prevailing, okay. Viewing human nature as inherently aggressive. So they deal with this theme a lot. I think they're trying to convert our worldview to look at human nature more positively as spiritually grounded and have guided through the ages. And we've lost touch with that, and a lot of things have gotten in the way. And they list the things that got in the way. Okay. 7. Is it my turn?
I'll read it. People long for peace, but view human nature as corrupt and incapable, a paralyzing contradiction.
8. Reassessing this common distortion will set constructive forces moving.
The current calamity is evolutionary, that is, unfolding towards a unifying coming of age.
10. Tumult marks our coming of age, and unifying structures can be built.
This supreme trial can be faced with confidence as we fulfill our innate excellence and divine destiny.
You know, the phrase innate excellence, I almost fainted with that one too at the time. And they said, and our divine destiny. So this was opening up my thinking categories, and I was quite receptive. So this is the introductory section. I think they're introducing this way of balancing realism and hope. And they want us to, they're showing us they have eyes to what's really happening, or the threats, like that second, unimaginable horrors. They're talking about like a nuclear holocaust kind of thing. Okay, and then the second section is all about religion and its substitutes in relation to peace. Religion and its substitutes. They use a phrase, ideologies and substitute faiths and dogmas of materialism. Those are 3 terms meaning that these are competing with religion and have made religion look weak. Okay, let's make you the even number. Okay.
The human spirit is inclined toward God. Spiritual luminaries galvanize spiritual and social progress.
13, attempting peace cannot ignore religion, which generates morality, law, and civilization.
Religion can establish world order, but it can also be corrupted.
That seems very true to me. Humanity's negligence, misunderstanding, and selfishness have separated faith and reason, religion and science, obscuring the founders' teachings.
Religions teach peace-inducing morality, the golden rule on unifying virtues.
Universal educators, that also means prophets or manifestations or spiritual luminaries. I love it when they use different phrases for the same thing. That improves the odds that the one of them is going to grab you. I like that. Universal educators are part of one civilizing process.
Religious fanaticism has undermined spiritual values and moral victories.
19, religious institutions are increasingly viewed as irrelevant, and many turn to material satisfactions and ideologies, deifying the state.
Substitute faiths have brought massive disillusionment, unrestrained power, blighting every region with spiritual damage to anguished millions.
Dogmas of materialism aggrandize nation, race, or class rather than bringing a new world of peace.
They glorify material pursuits, nourishing the falsehood that humanity is incorrigibly selfish.
Humanity's common failure calls for a common remedial effort. Will we continue in our waywardness or consult together for global solutions?
Let us sweep away obsolescent doctrines, safeguarding humanity's interests as a whole.
I've got to comment on this ideologies and substitute faiths. I was studying philosophy at the time, and there was this guy named Hegel and another guy named Marx. And they built a system that was so all-encompassing that it created something that we could call an ideology that competed with religion. In other words, it was answering the question, what is the meaning of life? What's the purpose of history? And they had an absolutist kind of nature to them. especially Hegel. This is so hard on me. I liked Hegel at first because he looked like a creative thinker. But near the end of his life, he got hardening of the categories. This is Harold's interpretation. And he started to say that the state, and he meant by that Germany, where he lived, was the divine expression on earth. So he was deifying the state. So ideologies like nationalism, unbridled capitalism, Marxism, communism are ideologies or substitute faith. So this, to me, changed the whole field of comparative religion. I was very interested in that. Now I realize, oh, you not only have to study religions, now you have to study these ideologies, which are making big claims on humanity, on humanity's loyalty and understanding. Okay, now in this third section, I call it, these are my titles, by the way. House of Justice puts 1, 2, 3, 4 for the sections. I always try to come up with a title. Deep Challenges and Lofty Principles of a Universal Framework. That's what they are going to introduce now. Okay, 25. This was a real shocker, because remember, this is a superpower standoff with nuclear weapons building up. They say banning nuclear weapons and settling specific conflicts alone cannot bring peace. A universal framework must be adopted.
The challenging requirements are clear, but there is paralysis of will, rooted in views of inevitable quarrelsomeness and unwillingness to establish a united world authority.
And then the next two are sort of positive. Let me read those two, and you read the next 5. Okay, Mafar? Because these are two positive things. Tentative steps toward your world order include many instances of regional cooperation among nations, like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Organization of African States, things like that. 28. UN declarations and conventions include those on human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt is one of my favorite people in history because she was the force behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What an amazing document. They list some of these other ones. Conventions on discrimination, genocide, hunger, and malnutrition, and there has been considerable technological process. Now, the next 5 are kind of like problems. Okay, read them all.
Racism retards potentiality, corrupts perpetrators, and blinds progress. Disparity between rich and poor brings instability to the very brink of war. Unbridled nationalism must give way to wider loyalty, world citizenship, and interdependent nations. Religious strife is abhorrent to people of faith and no faith, calling for compassion and truth-seeking.
And one more, women's inequality.
Women's inequality must be overcome for world peace to emerge.
See, again, that was listing the big problems. These are barriers to peace. And so I found it full of realism, this letter, but also grounded in hope for humanity's essential nature and our future. Okay, and then there's, they mentioned this relevant spiritual principles. I'll read these 4. 34, universal education must be provided to assure universal progress. And they use the lovely phrase world citizenship in that particular paragraph, which I love. But they're sort of saying every child should have access to the whole body of knowledge everywhere. All the positive learning that has come through the religions when they were not corrupt yet, when they were generating lofty civilizations. An international auxiliary language will greatly facilitate unity building. Abolition of war is a complex process that must be guided by enduring spiritual principles. Spiritual principles are immanent in human nature. Immanent in human nature. That jumped out at me again because I was a student of human nature at that time. Generating aspiration and will to better our world. Okay, and go on to the back now. And we're looking at that 4th section called Humanity's Oneness and a Call for Global Consultation. So my idea is we would finish that, these 2 sections, and then look briefly at those questions and see what people want to ask about or comment on. I'm very curious to how this sounds to people who are not Baha'i. You know, I was not Baha'i when I first read it. And I was trying hard to understand where is this coming from and why is it saying such wise things and integrating them so perfectly. It seemed to me it was integrating them, you know. Okay, and it wasn't speaking down, but it wasn't using language that was impossible to grasp. Okay, so this fourth section, humanity's oneness and a call for global consultation. So this is a call that they made very, very strongly. Okay, you can do 38.
How can our conflicted world be changed to a cooperative world?
39, consciousness of humanity's oneness, which means abandoning prejudice, can found a new world order.
Accepting humanity's oneness, unity is essential for world peace.
Keep going, there's 2 more on unity here.
Unity calls for reconstructing and demilitarizing societies while embracing diversity. Unity calls for broadening society's basis, a wider loyalty.
I appreciate that they were defining unity a little bit. It embraces diversity. It doesn't mean uniformity or getting rid of diversity. I was very worried about that because I was sort of a neo-enlightenment person, really believing in dignity and reason and the right to have a different point of view, etc. Then okay, where are we now?
43.
43. Here's a problem. Current international relations verge on anarchy. What a strong word. And the UN, as currently constructed, is incapable of preventing war. Okay, continue.
Baha'u'llah propounded collective security, whereby nations cede the claim to make war under an international executive, a world parliament, and a supreme tribunal.
I was shocked to hear the House of Justice talking about federalism, which is the idea of 3 major branches. I thought maybe that came from Montesquieu and the French, Revolution. And so this was the House of Justice saying with divine authority, or claiming to have divine authority, that this is what is needed. Those 3 branches working in a balanced way. Okay, did you read that? Then 45. Humanity needs a world community with a single code of international law where nationalism is transmuted into world citizenship. Remember, nationalism is one of those ideologies. You're deifying the state. I discovered, for example, that China, in some of its history in the 20th century, valued nationalism more than communism. So when push came to shove, they weren't going to join with Russia under a communist banner. They're going to hold on to their own type of communism. So nationalism was stronger. So that gave me a lesson about what is nationalism. How does it function?
Baha'u'llah prophesied an all-embracing assemblage to lay the foundation of the great peace.
An all-embracing assemblage. This momentous step requires spiritual maturity and global consultation.
The outcome would be an all-embracing sacred pact, the most great covenant.
Here we go again with the alternate phrases for the same thing. I love that. It's because you need to hear the same thing from different angles. So they're talking about an all-embracing assembly. They're talking about the most great covenant. They're talking about global consultation. They're talking about a sacred pact. And then 49 says, this mighty convocation. That's another phrase for this thing that had been prophesied by Baha'u'llah, I think around 1860s, 70s. Your turn.
We appeal to leaders of all nations to seize this opportunity.
Keep going.
Will the UN rise to this crowning event? Let every man, woman, and youth and child lift their voices in assent.
So here, this particular letter is now getting very practical. We're asking, this is a letter not to Baha'is, it's a letter to the peoples of the world. Can all of you help with this mighty convocation, which is utterly necessary to form something that you could call a United Nations? And so we had something called that in name, but it had a veto power, which made it impossible to enforce peace. So a true world government with a legislative, executive, and a tribunal, a judiciary, would be able to make a law and enforce it, saying there will be no war. As soon as something that looks like a war starts, the tribunal would say, for example, to Russia and Ukraine, we're studying this matter and we're going to decide and you're not going to fight about it. And we have the strength to keep you from fighting about it. That's what a world tribunal would be able to do if it worked with an executive that had a force that is the servant of justice, capital J. I almost fainted when I saw that. Okay, so the last section is uniting as a world family, advancing civilization, and the most great peace. I want to back up to that previous one. From 44 to 52, all of that, Baha'is call that the lesser peace. This is my understanding. I'm curious if anyone looks at it differently. That the lesser peace would be the time that humanity would achieve the lesser peace when we're actually able to abolish war. In other words, we have a world government that was politically arranged. That's not the same as the most great peace, which would be a moral, spiritual foundation for that. So it's a political peace that Baha'is can contribute to, but the leaders of the world are going to have to step up and do something about that. There's this lovely passage from Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, where he says, someday high-minded sovereigns are going to step up and call everyone to consult about universal peace. And they're going to build the most great covenant, and anyone who violates that world law, will be prevented. So there will always be some kind of political order. Very interesting. That's called collective security sometimes, that idea. All right, last, uniting as you can read 53.
We are optimistic about the crowning goal, one universal family.
See, this we here is the house of justice. That's who they're talking about. Sometimes they say we means humanity, but I think they're saying we, the house of justice, are optimistic about the crowning goal. Why? Because we believe it was prophesied by Baha'u'llah and taught by him, and he was a spiritual luminary. And he wasn't just sharing ideas, he had divine authority, moral spiritual authority, and could see the future in a way that human minds cannot do. But peace is unattainable unless and until unity is firmly established. Nation building has come to an end. World unity is our goal.
Among the favorable signs of this spiritual springtime are planetary civil service and interfaith cooperation.
In the letter, they called it ecumenism. But most of you know I do a lot of interfaith work, so I had to put interfaith cooperation. I think that's what they mean. I'm interpreting. Okay. Where are we? The Baha'i community is an example of this enlarging unity, showing the practicality of Baha'u'llah's vision.
We bow in humility before our Creator, who gave us the capacity to know Him and love Him.
We're getting very spiritual at the end here. 58. Humanity was created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization, and our innate excellence, same phrase as earlier, must manifest in this promised day of God.
The dream of peace is now invested with divine authority, summoning deeds of faith and sacrifice.
Baha'u'llah promised the most great peace shall come. And I'm understanding the most great peace is way beyond, in a way, the lesser peace. So that would be a politically arranged peace with high-minded sovereigns creating something like a real United Nations and a single code of international law and a number of other things mentioned. So that would be very, very good, but it wouldn't mean that humanity had internalized moral spiritual authority. That would take a couple of 100 years more. No one knows exactly how long these pieces of time are, as near as I can tell in the Baha'i community anyway. Okay, so going back to the questions, and I'm hoping, I tried to suggest we can talk about justice, we can talk about peace. I find Baha'i writings are sort of saying there's an order of things. To have justice, you have to, before you can get to justice, you have to be high-minded and mature and have some wisdom. And so it shows how hard it is to be just. But then if you have justice, that's still not peace or unity. So those are other phases. Anyway, do you have any comments about what is your own understanding of peace in this broad sense? Is it an evolutionary process? This letter is sort of saying it's evolutionary. It's part of our moral spiritual development. But imagine hearing this when there's nuclear weapons and saber rattling in 1985. And it's starting to happen again now. So I thought it was a good time to look back at this and see how similar that day is to our day. Anyone want to, it's such a huge room, you know, it's going to take a lot of courage for anyone to say anything. Okay, I want to say more about that most great peace. I was afraid this might happen. Anyway, because when I saw the room, you got to have a circle. But you can't have a circle with this many people in a room this size. I want to show you something, and I was fascinated with these images of the most great peace. That's what Baha'is call it. What is it called in other traditions? And it's called a whole lot of things. I want to just give you some of those terms. I find it utterly fascinating. Here. Indigenous view. One mighty flowering tree will shelter all the children of one mother and one father. I found out this sacred tree idea goes way, way back, to Paleolithic times, we think. So there's imagery and there's petroglyphs, etc., that sort of say there's a source of wisdom called the sacred tree or the world tree. When you follow that, you prosper, and when you don't, you get in trouble. And it has to be renewed by some holy one saying, let's go back to the wisdom of the sacred tree. Okay, Jewish vision. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb. They shall not hurt or destroy, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord. Zoroastrian image. One government shall rise among men. Weapons will all be made powerless. You know how I picture that? We have a weapon that destroys all weapons, makes them disappear. Then shall the final restoration take place in both worlds. I think the Zoroastrian scriptures are talking about this world and the upper world, the spiritual world, the final restoration. So humanity will be very mature by then. So that's the most great peace, an image of the most great peace, it seems to be. In the Hindu version, in the new golden age, not the one in the past, the new golden age, all shall be awakened as at the end of night, and they shall follow the laws of the age of purity. There's some kind of an age of purity coming where people will, in a sense, have absorbed the law, the moral spiritual law. They won't even have to be reminded of it very much. That's an interpretation. Buddhist image. The city of righteousness. Does that sound like a Buddhist term or not? To me it didn't. But I was sure that this was Buddhist scripture. Later, Mahayana. Okay. The city of righteousness in the pure land will be filled with people of all classes and lands. People of all classes and lands. An image of how people will live in the future. You know, I have to back up, and here's a digression. I got super excited to learn about something called cosmopolitanism. And this was an ancient Greek-Roman idea that everyone should be welcome into a world city. So that you could think of Athens as a world city, or Alexandria, or Rome. And I ignored that for a long time until I started studying this stuff. And it looked to me like that was an early version of the concept of world citizenship, which is mentioned 3 times in this letter by the House of Justice. 3 times, world citizenship. They were saying universal education should teach that, get people engaged in world citizenship. Okay, I'm going to a Chinese view. I think this is Confucian tradition. When the grand unity comes, all people everywhere shall live for the common good. This is part of a longer passage which I really love. It in effect says, the strong will take care of the weak. Oh, that would be beautiful. Christian view. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The holy city, Jerusalem, came down from heaven. Now here's a phrase that people don't know about very much, even Christians I find out. In the same book, the book of Revelation, it says, all that's going to happen with a tree of life for the healing of the nations. You know that tree of life thing? And I love that kind of stuff, where something that's very old, 12,000 years old at least, shows up in a modern scripture. And a lot of images of tree. I'm working a lot with indigenous people. They love the sacred tree image and the medicine wheel. And they love the fact that I can show them where the tree shows up in other scriptures quite a bit. It's an image of sacred wisdom. So the idea was the sacred tree would be open to heaven, so it's sort of filtering down the Creator, and that the wisdom that comes from the Creator. And Mother Earth is down below the sacred tree. Sacred tree has roots in the earth. And you have to ground yourself in the wisdom of the sacred tree, or else your tribe falls apart. I think that's what a lot of these indigenous prophecies are talking about. And here's a Islamic image. We, this is the royal we, Allah talking, we shall make a new creation as promised. My righteous servants shall inherit the earth. My righteous servants. And a Sikh image, all humanity shall live in peace together under a shield of administrative benevolence. When I first saw that, I thought, that's a line from Abdul Wahab, isn't it? It's in the Sikh scriptures. And then a Baha'i line, all people have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. I love that. That's sort of saying that's one of our high collective purposes. We're supposed to make together an ever-advancing civilization. That would mean things like all the arts, all the sciences, all the bodies of knowledge, all the social justice projects, everything should be, should be encouraged by a religious culture or an ever-advancing civilization. Any comments, questions, perplexities? You don't have to agree with all this mess. Please.
Thank you, Harold, first of all. So all of these unifying ideas, all of these religions, they're all saying the same thing from what you've just told us. And yet, right now, we find ourselves in this diversity of opinions and news stories, and we're fractionated. How can humanity be unified again? What's the path?
How can humanity what?
How can we unify? What's the path from where we are right now, where we're...
This is what all those questions were supposed to get at. You know, there's a whole bunch of solutions, quote unquote, in my list of questions. I was trying to disguise the fact that they were solutions, but they're sort of Baha'i responses to some of these questions. So look at the very bottom, for example. It says, questions for discussion, the very bottom. How can we foster unity in our communities, that is, where we live and beyond? Cultivating virtues in children and youth. Service projects, English corners, restorative justice for indigenous people. I say that because I live on the island and 10% of the island is indigenous, and I'm actually meeting them and doing things with them and learning about their interest in justice. It's very different. Oh, I want to write a book if I live long enough on justice, the ways it has evolved from the World Tree period till now. Justice ideas.
What do you mean justice?
Thank you.
Because justice, like there's a court of law, right, where justice makes a judgment. The judge makes a judgment and he decides you're guilty, you're not guilty. Like, are we saying is the universal house of justice a society that makes judgments that one group of people are wrong and another group of people are right?
You know, here's a collective definition of justice that I got from non-Baha'i sources. In other words, literature about justice. When people try to define it, what do they say? They say stuff like this: a moral spiritual ideal, as well as a concrete social process, providing wide participation, affording basic rights, requiring basic duties, rights and duties, encouraging cooperation, fostering optimal degrees of freedom and equality, appropriate rewards and punishments, seeking restoration, virtuous conduct, and a flourishing society. Now, of course, there's many definitions of justice. You know, all those ideologies I was mentioning, those are concepts of justice. I had to face that fact when I was looking at the history of justice. So Nazism was a philosophy of justice. Society will be better if we get rid of the inferior people. Capitalist social Darwinism would say if someone is in an advanced social and economic position, they should be. That proves that they're fit. And everyone who's not, the hell with them. I mean, let's weed them out. I'm being very extreme to show that their concepts of justice are widely divergent. And some of them, I think, got generated in this moral vacuum of the 19th century. It's when ideologies were getting strong and religions were getting very weak. In fact, that's my theory. Because religion had grown so weak, ideologies became pseudo-religions or substitute faiths. So I'm not saying I have a corner on defining justice. One thing I did find, looking at Baha'i writings on justice, I found 12 words that keep coming up when justice is being talked about. And I think you'll like the sound of them. Let me just find that list. Equity, that means you're varying the rule to make room for the needs of a particular situation. You're bending the rule. Okay, equity. I want to tell you what Thomas Aquinas said about that. He said, if you have a rule that the gates of the city shut at 10 o'clock and your soldiers have been fighting all day to protect you and they're not home yet, open the gates for the soldiers. Right? So in other words, that would be equity. You're modifying the law to accommodate justice. Interesting. So equity means sensitive to the particular case and the feelings involved and the capacities, the needs. Another word that's used a lot in Baha'i writings regarding justice is moderation. Another one is righteousness. Another one is impartiality, compassion, counsel, capital C, wisdom. I love that one. Fairness, balance, advancement. Beauty surprised me. That beauty comes up in mentioning the laws of justice. Wow. So that's almost an aesthetic concept. Following law is a beautiful thing. You should enjoy it. Someday we will. It's like we're going to grow in that direction. And during the most great peace, we will love social order and be happy to contribute to it. It might be unthinkable to do something harmful in the future. Okay, did I get anywhere? You don't have to agree with all that either. What's behind your question about what is justice? Because it really could be a lot of different things.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's
Yeah.
just that a lot of the concept of justice in my mind has a lot about deciding what's right and wrong and good, whereas a lot of the time what we think is wrong is just a judgment we make that it's just different than how we feel rather than actually being good or bad.
You know, once upon a time, I loved ethics as a field of study, and I was learning in the Western academia setting. There's only two kinds of ethical systems. One was one based on rules, and the other is based on benefits. So if you emphasize rules, you're saying an ethical person is someone who follows rules, whether they feel like it or not, and independent of the consequences of following that rule. And then the utilitarian or benefits ethical analysis says the greatest good for the greatest number is what we should be aiming for. So we want to benefit the largest possible. So those are very different concepts of ethics. And I remember looking at those and thinking, is that all there is? I thought, I understood both of those kinds. And I said, it doesn't. So when I just started studying world religions, I realized they have a third kind of ethics that's not emphasizing pure law or rules and not emphasizing benefit only, but virtues. So cultivating qualities of a person so that you can contribute to a flourishing society. That's the word that virtue jurisprudence experts like to use, that the goal of law should be to make a flourishing society. Not just to sort out the right from wrong and put people in prison who deserve a higher. And I think the Baha'i faith is more consistent with that, as I think all the religions are. There's more of a virtue ethic in the world religions. But religions can get corrupt, like this letter said. They can get old and crusty, like Hegel with his hardening of the categories. But you could also say justice is simply, I believe this, like a schedule. When someone makes a schedule for resources, allocating time and place for certain things, that's sort of a little justice system. If you break it, there should be a good reason to do so. right? Like you're accommodating, you're using equity. So, yeah, I've come to believe you have to balance a lot of things to come to justice, and we'll get better at that. Humanity will grow in our understanding of justice. In the meantime, there's a lot of suffering that's totally unnecessary. So some theories of justice emphasizing get rid of suffering. Do that first. Eliminate like Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's that kind of starting point regarding justice.
What was that again?
The injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So that makes you alert to, is there some injustice around here that I can improve? My work with restorative justice is trying to use circle justice or an indigenous approach rather than deciding who's right and wrong, right? You're sort of trying to heal. You're trying to, I think that restorative justice will be more common in the future when we identify with humanity as our family, the same way indigenous people have identified with tribal families. So I once heard an indigenous lawyer say, someone who breaks a law and hurts someone is acting as if they don't have a family. That's fascinating to me. So they don't feel any moral obligation. That's why they hurt somebody. So we have a lot to learn from indigenous people. That thing that Jesus said, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. I've always assumed that was talking to figures like indigenous peoples or humble people. That there will come a time when those people will have more moral persuasion than the high and mighty. I think the religions say that. I hear this in the new Pope a little bit. He's trying to be a sequel to Pope Francis. There's too many people here, so it's hard to get a good discussion going with a lot of participants. I knew that would happen. Who doesn't like something they heard? It takes courage to bring that up, but it always improves the discussion if someone disagrees with something. Jonathan, you're good at disagreeing with things. And making an astute observation, intelligently.
I make one comment. Thank you, first of all, the presentation was great, and thank you so much as always for the handouts, because there's a lot to think about. I think we can all take home and consider later. But one thing that's interesting, I know, is that at least when I first read the message, it left me with a sense of optimism. That world peace was inevitable, in the sense that we could just kind of kick back and relax.
Oh, they didn't say that.
Oh. So let's go ahead and let it happen. But as time is going on, you see that it's actually, it's 40 years. It was either prescient or very wrong, because nothing's really, you could argue, seems like it's changed much, right? And in thinking about that, how things could be bad and yet world peace be inevitable, I keep coming to the conclusion that the message doesn't say. It doesn't say, it says world peace would be inevitable, but it never anywhere says that it's going to be easy,
no,
costless, or without strife.
Mention sacrifice.
Any of these things, right? That it's going to be a challenge for us to get there. Well, what concerns me is it also leaves it open. That the goal may be inevitable, but there's two roads to get there. And I think the jury's still out on which road we're going to take. We're either going to have this act of consultative will, where we come together and say,
or unimaginable horrors.
Unimaginable horrors. And you could say, which road does it look like we're taking?
Two.
We're cruising for a bruising. That's the way it looks. But they also, they put good news in here. They mention there are steps. They call them tentative steps. Regional cooperation, So those are warm-up exercises. Those are good. And they don't get into the news much. Good news is still not that popular, because I think of this assumption that we have, that people are basically corrupt. There's a book. Jonathan, you would like this book. It's called Humankind, all one word, Humankind. And he basically is saying, this is like a 30-year-old Dutch journalist. He was researching all the studies about human evil and human good. And he said, he gave a scenario. He says, imagine a plane that crashes, breaks into 3 pieces. And in planet A, the people would all be fighting for themselves and stomping all over people to get out of the plane and not caring about anyone but themselves. In planet B, they would help the weak and the elderly and the children first. And he said it's overwhelming evidence that that's the more common pattern. You know, I've been reading a lot of Chinese stuff, and that was an ancient debate about, are people intrinsically good and can be cultivated to good behavior, or are they basically selfish and corrupt and need a strong law that's enforced immediately? There was a guy named Han Fei. I couldn't even read this guy. I disliked it so much. Then I realized I have to read it because I can't understand Chinese thought through the ages. So Han Fei was, China is named after Qin Shi Huangdi. China is named after him. He conquered 8 or 9 warring provinces, and suddenly 500 years of fighting stopped. And he said, we're going to burn all the philosophy books except Han Fei's books. See, I like him. You know, in other words, he's saying there should be strong laws immediately enforced in public view, and no one's in doubt about that. Legalism, philosophical legalism, based on his understanding of human nature. So that's just a clear example of a debate that goes on throughout time in different cultures. And it looks to me like people are more good than bad. And I think that the House of Justice is pointing that a lot. It's saying we have innate excellence. We require education to bring it about. We have gems, of wonder. And with education, they're polished and they get to express themselves. And so they're constantly talking about, yes, we can make the world better. Yes, we have innate excellence. Yes, we can lose sight of it. Yes, we can conclude people are evil and angry and dangerous and crawl into ourselves. So one of the questions I asked in the beginning there was like, do you think people are, because of the bad news in the world, the threshold of it, are we crawling inward, or are we thinking more broadly and how to solve the problem for the world? I honestly don't know what the answer to that is. I wish I could interview the whole world and get a sense of, do you have hope? Any other comments, questions? And even let's have some disagreements. The spark of truth comes forth from the...
Should we raise our hands? Who has hope?
Oh, you want to do some empirical research? Okay, who has hope? How many? That's about a third? No, half? But this is a warped group. These are Baha'is. A lot of Baha'is here. They're barraged with a lot of this positive view of human nature and reminders. We've been taught some good things throughout history. At intervals, we seem to have lost track of it. The spiritual luminaries.
It's hard to always have hope. You sometimes have hope, and when you see unfairness or cruel things, then it's harder to keep being hopeful.
What happened in Gaza was tough on me. I just thought that was so bad that children are getting killed and health workers. Outrageous. But I guess there's more to it. Then they say, oh, we were targeting Hamas. We say what you were doing. Like right now in India and Pakistan, they're each claiming, no, they're just targeting enemies, terrorists. So truth is the first casualty of war. It's very hard to figure out what's going on in conflict. We behave better, we're more predictable. Yeah, I think we should, the tariff thing. Boy, it's making, there's a term I'm noticing a lot. It's called transactional ethics. So I'm going to do something only if I benefit from it. That's transactional. You could call it selfishness. You could call it me-firstism. As opposed to spiritual principles, high moral spiritual principles. Here's an interesting observation. I knew a Jewish woman who said she was an atheist. And I happen to know she was an extremely popular teacher of justice. That was her theory, her specialty. Jurisprudence, that's called. Philosophy of law, emphasizing what is justice, how do we bring it about. And I asked her one day, is justice something that you think is discovered, or is it something invented? And I said, think about the difference. So if it's invented, that means people make up justice. If it's discovered, it exists as some kind of moral reality out there. And she thought about it very carefully and said, yeah, that came up a lot in her courses. She said, I think justice exists independent of human interaction. So that convinced me. So for her, justice is a transcendent value. It shapes her. So I don't call her an atheist. In my mind, she has a concept of the divine. She's focused on one name or one attribute of the divine. But also you could bet your life on her help. You know, he's a very trustworthy person. Please.
What was her reason for saying that?
She said things like she found common echoes in the various theories of justice. And she was forced to look at Islamic law, Sharia a little bit, and comparative law, it's called, French system.
We are talking about the nature, not the people. You know, when a lion is trying to hunt something, I don't think it's going after the strongest one.
So you're contrasting the law of the jungle versus...
Yes, that's nature.
That's nature.
We are not just nature.
That's something I'm noticing throughout this literature, that people distinguish between divine law, human law, and natural law. I see echoes of this in Baha'i writings, so there's three kinds of law floating around. We're getting off into my next book, Justice, but it's related to this thing. We're talking about peace and justice generally. And I think this House of Justice letter is saying it is difficult. There's many parts, and they're trying to name a lot of the parts, the barriers, racism, women's inequality, and adopt a universal framework, step back and think about principle. All that makes a lot of sense. It didn't land on me all at once. I just found some of it seemed brand new. Never thought of those ideas before. But I went back to this letter many times over the years. Found it very, very enriching. The fact that it was written to the peoples of the world, right? I get it in my mailbox. I wondered if the local Baha'is put it there, or it was just sent to everyone in the world, you know. Anyway, please.
Yeah, Harold, as a historian, I'm curious to find out what you think. Over human history that you've researched, what was the most peaceful time? Because we sometimes feel like we're in a turbulent time. Compared to the rest of human history, where do we actually stand actually?
That's a really important question. And you know, education, starting in elementary and high school and college, should emphasize that there have been times, I call them spiritual renaissances. There have been times, usually 200 to 300 years long, where humanity was doing it almost right. You know, I might have mentioned this in some other chat recently, but the Gupta Empire, it seemed there were 4 good emperors in a row who were very receptive to Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain wisdom. And in a formula, what I came to is, if you have rulers that are patrons of learning, in other words, they use their power to generate learning in a society. So they attract, say, really good architects. They attract good artists. They reward them. They try to make sure more people can contribute. They have a cosmopolitan idea, with or without that word. We want people to benefit in this society. We want to improve the odds that it blooms and grows. I found in the Gupta Empire there was a book on drama that totally blew me away. It was a science of drama, going into the details of how do you make a beautiful play, and how do you, and what emotions are you appealing to? How should audiences react? And they were in it, when I was reading it, thinking, this is 1750 years old. This book, it was in that Gupta Empire. They had a mathematician named Aryabhata. In India, if you want to have high expectations for your kid, you call him Aryabhata, because he's like the Galileo and Einstein of ancient India. He was in that Gupta Empire. Because you have 4 emperors in a row who encourage learning, that means someone is going to hit the jackpot in all these fields. So that has happened. It doesn't get much press. There was a high water mark under Darius and Cyrus the Great in ancient Persia. I think David and Solomon did pretty well. I think there were some good rulers in Alexandria for a few hundred years. It became like a learning capital of the world. There were several high points in Islamic civilization, several. One in Spain, one in Sicily, one in Baghdad, one in Gondeshapur. Bunches of places where these caliphs said, you know, Muhammad said, seek knowledge from cradle to grave. And they had the power to bring that about. So your name is Landra, right? Or, no.
Yeah.
That is it?
My last name, yeah.
Oh, what's your
Rakila.
first name? Rakila.
Yeah.
So, in other words, history is, the dark view of history is what dominates in the university.
Right.
That's my impression. And to be fair, or just, you have to look at when people were almost doing it right. Not perfectly, but very well.
But we
And
tend to study conflicts.
Yeah, when we decided to study war no more, for a while, right? Yeah. Even Charlemagne, some people don't like Charlemagne, but he did some good things, including make a court that he was trying to make a new Athens, attract people who had excellence from different angles. And they would take biblical names and ancient Greek names too. So take on two names, and he highly literate court for a while.
So what would be the similarity between all of the, you've just mentioned several periods of peace. What can we learn from those periods of peace rather than studying the conflict in human history? If we studied the peace of human history, what could we learn to make our present day better?
We would really have to learn the power of education in a nutshell. So, you know, Abdu'l-Baha wrote The Secret of Divine Civilization, little skinny book, 105 pages. And I think he's saying the secret of divine civilization is when the rulers access the highest moral spiritual wisdom around. And they value knowledge from wherever it comes, even from your enemy. So to me, it sounds like a simple formula. Patrons of learning, look for the patrons of learning in history. And whenever you have two in a row, or three or four, ooh, like there's something special about that. Comments, questions, complaints, alternate realities, points of view, complaints. Please.
I have one question. Have you ever thought about why we have different religion and why actually Baha'i faith came out?
Yeah, why
You know
was the Baha'i faith necessary?
Why it happened?
Well, briefly, you know, I used to not believe in prophecy. Prophecy, you know, I was a rational man. That sounds airy-fairy to me. But what started to happen is when I studied prophecies, I put them in 4 boxes. And I started noticing a pattern. There are prophecies of the promised one who's coming, prophecies of doom. In other words, it's going to get bad before the promised one comes. And then there's a kind of prophecy, it's more subtle, called judgment. So when the promised one comes, people will have to decide, is this new teaching true or rejected? And then the prophecies of the promised day are really amazing to me. I read you some of them, right, where they say in the future we'll turn swords into plowshares and things like that. Please.
If you ask me, I am Iranian. You know, the Baha'i faith came out, if you know some Muslim leaders actually, they created it. If you didn't know that. You know,
You say a Muslim leader, but
they had some books and some actually ideas.
Sheikh Ahmad, are you talking about?
Yeah, Baha'u'llah took those things and actually started a new religion. Basically, the social reason behind it is because we got defeated with different wars with the new European powers. We used to think about ourselves, we are the best in the world. And he actually tried to make peace with the new reality.
You know what you're saying, so here's a prophecy from me, Harold's prophecy. Someday we're going to have conferences where we talk exactly about that. We get scholars together, or anyone interested, and study carefully the history and the prophecies and who learned from who. You know, what I found is when someone knows something that they didn't learn, like that was a quantum leap for me. So Muhammad knew things he was never taught. So that means he has a different station, I think. Buddha knew things he wasn't taught. Jesus knew things he wasn't taught. It looks to me like Baha'u'llah knew a lot of things he wasn't taught. So that's like a different station. I'm not saying everyone has to buy that, but I didn't believe in capital R revelation until I was pondering history and the impact like that Muhammad had, right? Now, but someday they're going to have to take a careful look at what you're talking about, you know, and be very scientific. Take turns, be respectful, listen to the arguments. Where did you get your sources? But politely, right? As opposed to, you know, like an intellectual war, which is what usually happens, like an intellectual war, trying to make someone look stupid rather than get at the truth.
No, I didn't try to be rude. I was telling you basically my idea is religion is a good thing, but the time is past for that.
Yeah, that's, you know, a lot of people think that. And the evidence for that is what I call religious decline. There's a preponderant evidence that religious civilizations do decline. Their virtues turn into vices. So I've been studying that too. So it's like it looks like religious civilization have a lifespan. Birth, growth, maintenance, high point. That's for you, Raquela, the high point. Is sometime in that maintenance period you reach the highest point. And then it starts to go down, and you're just maintaining, and then you start to decline, and the virtues turn into vices, and there's manipulation, and desperate attempts to reform, highly militaristic too. In the decline, you get more and more militaristic. Toynbee said that. You get highly nationalistic and militaristic in the decline phase of a civilization. So civilizations do have a lifespan. They get very old and negative. If you only collect that data, it looks like humanity's story is very bleak. So I had to learn to...
Stages of America's civilization that we're now seeing all this militarism, you know, people getting dragged away to different countries, even though they're American citizens. And
you know, Baha'is try to not...
It sounds like you're describing the U.S. and what you're saying right now.
But my understanding, Baha'is are not supposed to... We're supposed to...
50 years ago, we were at a... Say 20, 30 years ago, we were at a high point in the U.S. where, you know,
economically
and now that's when the Soviet, the Berlin Wall came down and Soviet Union collapsed. At that time, it looked like things was just clear sailing, and all of a sudden, we're in this situation where, you know, we have a trade war where you know, the next step is we're going to be defending the border with the U.S.
I hear what you're saying. I think Baha'is are supposed to have the discipline of not naming names, but talk about developments and processes. It's not easy to do.
Yeah.
I once went to a conference of Baha'i scholars where this was right after Trump got elected. They were talking the whole time about him, but they never mentioned his name. They were talking in principles, and they were talking about autocracy and democracy and requirements of these things. They were trying to, in this letter they mentioned this universal framework. You need a universal framework to evaluate things. Otherwise, you get into the bandwagon of fighting for one cause as opposed to other causes, and you're at war with everyone who thinks differently. So if we could have new mental habits that try to look for common ground. Are there positive developments that we can throw into the equation? Can we talk about politicians without mentioning their names or their parties? Can you, you know, my solution is we should learn how to identify trustworthy civil servants. That should be a course in school. What you know, identify trustworthy civil servants starting in first grade. And maybe that's a silly idea, but you see what I mean? Bring a moral, spiritual perspective to leadership and government, and is a ruler consultative?
But once again, you're going backwards. So you're saying that we should have names of the good people. But so if we're saying we have names of the good people, then I
might be inconsistent. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Those people are good, but how do we say they're not bad, saying they're good rather than not bad? So we shouldn't name the.
But when I say
Trust
Darius
is
and
in-
Cyrus were great, I think I can back it up.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
what did they do? You know, they integrated. There were 20 provinces there, and they set up 4 capitals, and they set up an infrastructure, and they set up libraries, and an educational system, and a postal system, and a moderate taxes. And they said, "You keep your gods." And they would say things like, I think Cyrus was brilliant. He said, he'd begin an invocation saying, in the name of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, and whatever other gods there may be. What a brilliant tactician, right? To say that in an empire that has 20 big countries put together. Yeah, so I'm mentioning Cyrus. Yeah, you got me there. I like to mention kings who were, they were patrons of learning. So I found out things like they set up an incredible legal system. They had something like what we would call the rule of law. In other words, a king could actually be punished. There were rules. Not that got followed, consistently throughout Persian history, but they had the rule. I found the same thing in China. They had the rule of law. In the Mahabharata, it says any ruler who harms his people should be executed. It says it rather bluntly, Not that was always followed, but I found that that's interesting because in the West we think the Magna Carta was the first place only, 800 years ago. That idea has been around, and you have to identify civilizations and their periods, their stages to try to get at who brought that about. So I'm inconsistent. I mention good guys and I try to avoid naming bad guys. But about Hitler, Hitler's fascism, you could study that, sort of objectively, looking at the worldview underlying it. The need for a scapegoat and that sort of thing. You could study the structure of fascism, but that's elevating it to the level of principle. Please, Jonathan.
We're just a few minutes shy of 8 o'clock, and I know we want to give people a chance to talk
Yeah.
to you individually and also discuss, but maybe take a couple more questions.
Who almost said something a little while ago? Or asked? Or complained? Please.
First of all, Harold.
Rocio,
Hi.
good to see you.
Good to see you. Nothing complicated. I think, first of all, I think that you are so brave standing up there and talking to us about these sensitive
Thank you.
topics, because it touches every heart, right? I think that nowadays, why I find very important to have these conversations is because that allows us to see where we are in our very individual life, where we are at in the history, in spiritually, or what can we do towards what is happening out there.
Can you
So I
just,
have
I'm sorry, just make sure you repeat her question because I won't even hear her.
no, I'm not asking any question.
She's
I'm
making a
just
comment. Yeah.
We can't hear you
We
very
can't
well.
hear you well.
Ah,
Could you please stand up?
thank you.
Thank you.
So I was saying that he's very brave talking about these sensitive topics. And why I personally find this very useful is because it allows me, and maybe some of you, to see where we are at in the world, historically, spiritually, like what can we do if these things are happening in Ukraine, in India, Pakistan, and the US, which is very close, but what can I do myself? Suffering, being a bad person because I'm angry, listening the news. So I think at some point we are very much addicted to listening the news because we feel that's smart. That's my case sometimes. But we should stop listening to the news and trying to do better things with our
Do
lives.
something good. Like what we're doing is pretty good. This is called public discourse. I think that's what Baha'is call this. That's one of the things we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Bring things up, levels of principles applied to the world, and how can we make the world better? Also projects, the service projects, teaching children virtues. working with indigenous people. There are some specific things. English Corner, you try to help people adapt to an English-speaking society. You know, there are specific things. Art, it can be a social contribution. You know, I think someday there's going to start to be plays, morality plays that are global. There once were such a thing in ancient Greece. Fantastic morality plays. And that's going to happen again.
And just one last thing I wanted to mention. I think that we shouldn't forget why we are here, why we came to Canada. Unless there is a First Nation person here, which I would respect a lot, the rest of us just came from our countries looking for something better, looking for more security, more opportunities, this and that. So we need to keep that in our minds to realize how lucky we are and work towards that positive. Whatever we can do, honor and own that privilege of being where we are and work positively. In that way, as you say, helping the community to grow, so that at least we because that piece that we are reading in the letter, I don't think we are gonna see it, unfortunately. But we are here to work towards that piece.
Should we quit if we don't see the world change in the direction we would like it to change?
No.
Some people want to do that. It's not changing the way I wanted to change, I'm quitting.
Yeah.
Please.
So this is the beauty of when you brought in the indigenous people. They're always, one of the principles is think about the seventh generation ahead.
That's right.
Right? Like, is this gonna be beneficial all the way through the 7 generations?
You know, my concept of law has completely changed from studying indigenous approaches to law. You know, they use the term colonial law. I heard that and didn't know what it meant. And now I got a very deep understanding, a much deeper understanding, I think, of that. So it looks to me like England, France, and the US, and maybe a few other countries, started to colonize other parts of the world and impose on them a law that they thought was superior because it came from a superior culture. All kinds of assumptions under that. Now, again, but I think there's a book I found called Healing as Justice, and it's about 800 pages full of essays by indigenous lawyers and judges. And they are trying to build a bridge between an ancient circle justice and contemporary justice. So, but it's interesting. Like I knew a guy who taught comparative law, and that, you know what that meant? That meant French, English, and British. Now, and from my point of view, comparative law should include Sharia. It should include ancient Africa. It should include a wide range of indigenous traditions. It should look at Buddhist law. It should look at Hindu law. It should look at ancient Persian law. You'd find in there things like a human rights doctrine and multiculturalism by another name. So that's truly comparative law. Right? Then you're serious, looking at humanity's experience with law and justice. Please.
I saw just one last question. Actually, we have Felicia. You had your hand up. Just Felicia's a member of the West Vancouver School Trustee Board.
Oh,
so with all the talk about education, I'm not surprised that her hand went up. So
terrific.
Maybe our last question, and then we'll move on.
Sorry, I'm not trying to. Jonathan, I think tonight's topic, the justice, the peace and justice, is so meaningful. Like this is profound, but it's also very abstract. Like it's very difficult to really go to details and who
guilty as charged. I'm guilty as charged.
Who doesn't want peace? Who doesn't want justice? But again, like just what Harold pointing out, it's just very difficult to even figure out just the definition of justice in different cultures, in different society. I'll quickly give you a very small story because I actually counted this for the couple of 2 days. My husband, he went to China for about 3 weeks, which he hasn't been back for a couple of years. Me too, I haven't been back for about 10 years. So he came back and shared one small observation with me. He said, the distance between people in that city where we are from is like 20 million people population, just one city. So like people had like when you're walking down the streets, people would probably like almost touch you, like, but they don't feel like this is a violation of their boundary. But because he has lived here for that long enough, and even like both of them grew up in China, we grew up in almost educated there most of the time. But then now we went back and feel so uncomfortable. Like we would normally accuse those people that's in violation of personal boundary,
space,
like there's no space and something like that. But like especially during COVID, but then people there, they feel it's very natural. Like as long as I don't touch you, I don't really harm you and make you and that do you any harm. Like it's okay, right? Something like that. This is something like I've been thinking about for the last couple of days. So, but what I'm trying to say is, I just want to echo on that. But what I'm trying to say is that one of your questions, very interesting, is that our circle of concern becoming smaller or larger. I think this. I also give a lot of thought on this question. I feel like because the internet, because we actually are we're accessible to all the world news like 24/7. Like me too, it's like you. I actually subscribe to so many podcasts, like listening to non-stop. Like even when I'm doing gym, I'm doing everything. I'm on the podcast news, like everything. So I feel like very much like brain rot. That's actually the word of 2024 Oxford Dictionary.
Brain rot?
Brain rot. Yeah, because it means like you constantly receive information. Your brain is anyway, so I feel like we are so care about what happened just when you started. You immediately use the news about India and Pakistan and then Ukraine. Like we care about the world so much. Like it become, let alone like tariff, everything. It seems like that's surrounding us. But however, at the same time, like I especially, when I'm here, I become much, like at the same time, I often remind myself, I have to constant because it's very easy to forget, like because we always focus on the negative news on the world. But I also have to constantly remind myself is that like, you have to be very kind to the people around you, like because those people actually you can directly affect it. It's also one thing because during the spring break, I'm not proud to admit that I actually watch a show called Netflix show called what's it called, White Lotus. You guys know that
White
show?
Lotus.
Yeah, it's a drama, very dramatic. Anyway, but it's a spring break, okay? I need some break, so I watched that show. That shows a very typical American family went on holiday, and among the families, there's kids, very spiritual, went to Thailand, where there's a kids, there's 3 seasons, different families, but there's one family that's 2 siblings. So this older sister, she seems care about the whole world all the time. But at the same time, she's super mean to her younger brother because she wanted to hang out with her friend. So she ordered her younger son to, brother to sleep in the cabin, the kitchen, in the suites, in the beautiful resorts. So her mom made a comment saying, "How come you care so much about the world, but you're so mean to your own family and friends?" So I'm trying just to make this like, at the same time when we care about so much about the world and peace and justice, like just be really kind to the people around you. I think that's the first step.
The way I try to, that's beautiful, everything you said. You gotta go soon, but my wife reminds me of the same thing you just said. What are you gonna do with all these theories that you're learning? So, like, okay, we are on a refugee committee. We're helping refugees. And I'm now the president of this Restorative Justice Society. I don't know how to be president of that, but I'll learn fast. So, in which case you get to learn real problems. There's a thinker on justice who says exactly what you're saying. He says, start from the bottom up. So he says, low-hanging fruit. Look for injustice right around you and do something about it. That's how you should begin your study of justice. He got a Nobel Prize for economics, and he wrote a fat book on justice called The Idea of Justice, and he was critiquing all these theories, that don't have practical application, right? That he thought theories were mostly, they're talking to rulers, or you're talking to, government officials. But what about ordinary people? Everyone can make a contribution. So I think that is very, Amartya Sen is his name, Amartya Sen. Completely different kind of approach. He was quoting Martin Luther King a lot. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So start where you see it, right away. This is a great discussion. A huge room. I couldn't believe this many people could hang in here for, an hour and 40 minutes. My goodness. Thank you. So anyone else? Jonathan, why don't you bring order to this chaos here?
Order simple. We have some refreshments back here for everyone to enjoy. If you look on your handout, you'll see Harold's email. You can reach him that way. And however you found about this event, there's going to be others that will be hosting Harold again when he comes to visit the island. So yeah, time to chat and to visit with one another. We don't have to leave the room yet, so you can stay and speak with Harold.
Harold, you get some chocolates for coming all the way from Vancouver Island.
Reward and punishment is part of justice. Reward and punishment. I must have done more good than harm. That's what I take this to mean. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harold.
Thank you so much. Maybe it's supposed to be, you gotta make another one.